So welcome to the April edition of the Crediton Area History Talks. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Tony Gale, who is sitting in the room with two metaphorical hats on today. Tony is part of the organising team for the U3A, but Tony is also very much involved with Crediton Area History, and the latter is kind of where most of the research sits for today's topic, St Lawrence Chapel, I think. So I will pass over to you, Tony. You can decide which of your hats you wish to wear whilst you introduce yourself, and then you can go from there.
Excellent. Thank you indeed, Mark. Okay, so let's think about that conundrum while I fire up this presentation. Just hoping that everyone's going to be okay with seeing that. I'm showing you today something, it's a piece of research, as Mark says, which has been kind of, it's taken a little while to actually sort of come to this point, but as you will see as I go through this, the mainspring of the talk came from some material which I was able to find in the archives, an unexpected find for them and for me, in the archives of the Crediton Area History and Museum Society. So, so I guess that's the main hat I'm wearing today. I've called this talk Ancient and Relatively Modern. I will be introducing you to the two people you can see on the screen there during the course of this talk. And I've actually called the talk A History of the Chapel and Hospital of Crediton, of St Lawrence at Crediton, between the years 1242 and 1921. And it's kind of ancient and relatively modern for two reasons. Firstly, that's an awfully long period of time. We're talking about a lifespan of very nearly 800 years, which we'll be trying to see during the course of this. And secondly, because the chapel itself is both ancient and relatively modern, which is something we will find out as we go through. So here we go. It really is a fine old building. Those of you who are local to Crediton will know that, but it's a rather beautiful little place in a quiet little corner of the town. And it's got records which go back very nearly 800 years. But one of the questions which I wanted to ask and explore in this talk is just how old is it? We can set the scene by thinking about the association of St Lawrence the Saint, if you like, with the town. And there are three things here which bear that name. We have, or we had, a St Lawrence Fair, a St Lawrence Green, and a St Lawrence Chapel and Hospital. The earliest mention we've got of St Lawrence Fair at Crediton is in the year 1231, when Henry III granted a license for it. There's no mention in the records as to why it should have that name, but I think we can reasonably assume that it reflected some sort of existing association between the town and the saint. In other words, there was probably already something here, although I don't know what, in Crediton, which had been dedicated to him. So as you can see there, that was a grant by Walter, the Bishop of Exeter, for a fair at Crediton on the Feast of St Lawrence, which is the 10th of August. And indeed that fair, in a very small and modest way, that fair has been started up again in recent years. Nothing like what a medieval fair would have been like. They were an important part of the annual calendar of a community. They often revolved around the buying and selling of specific commodities. So you could think locally of Bampton Pony Fair or Tavistock Goosey Fair. But they would also draw in lots of other dealers and stallholders. all the records suggest there seems to have been a lot of eating and drinking and what you might euphemistically call a holiday atmosphere, which is no doubt why they had to be licensed by the Crown. This was one of 3 fairs in Crediton over the centuries, but this one actually predates the other 2. St. Mark's Fair, as it was originally called, was on the 25th of April, which is St. Mark's Day, and the other was on the Nativity of Mary, and the first record of either of those is in 1309, so that's 80 years later than the St. Lawrence Fair. So what about the borough, about the St. Lawrence Green rather? It's worth noting that in 1231, that was also the year when Henry III granted a charter for the foundation of the borough of Crediton. The same year as he granted St. Lawrence Fair. The most important feature of a medieval borough was the market, which would have been in a specified location along the high street. There would have been markers at either end denoting the limits of the fair. St. Lawrence Fair, like the borough, had a specified location, and that was on St. Lawrence Green, which was and is a public open space lying between the borough and the chapel. So what about the chapel itself? Well, the earliest record of it is just slightly later than the first mention of the fair, dating from the year 1242. I have to tell you that what it says has caused a lot of speculation and confusion over the years. It is the grant of permission for a reclusorio, of a hermit, if you like, rather somewhere for a hermit to live, which is juxta, near or close to, St. Lawrence Chapel, Apud, which is at or near Crediton. Well, this has led to all sorts of claims that the chapel was originally a hermitage, that the hermitage was built onto an existing chapel, or that the hermitage was somewhere else in Crediton, perhaps at the top of George Hill. Well, it's clear when you actually read this that the chapel was already in existence when this grant was made. So, by extension, the chapel itself wasn't originally a hermitage. And I also asked you to consider why a hermit, whose main aim in life was to isolate himself from the world, would have lived quite so close to a weekly market and an annual fair. Ain't gonna happen. I suggest that this reclusio was built somewhere else in the area, remembering that it just says it's near the Chapel of St. Lawrence, and it would have been somewhere reasonably distant from the hubbub of a thriving town. We get to learn a bit more about the chapel in 1249, when there are 4 separate bequests, all of which are bequests of land to someone called Brother Nicholas, the master of the Hospital of St. Lawrence at Crediton. So we've got local people, local property holders, bequeathing land in their wills. The institution is run by someone who's now called Brother Nicholas, and that by this date, 1249, it was being styled as a hospital. I invite you to think about that word hospital and what it might have meant in the 13th century. Just think about 3, maybe 4 modern words with a shared root and overlapping meanings. We use the word hospital to mean a place for identifying and treating medical conditions. We use hospitality to mean the provision of food and drink to people beyond our own immediate households. A word, incidentally, which has been much in evidence over the last year, when hospitals have been stretched to the limit, whilst the hospitality industry has been shut down for most of that time. Thirdly, we use the word hostel to mean somewhere providing rather basic accommodation for travellers. Youth hostels, backpacker hostels, you get the picture. Whilst the associated word hotel has come to mean something a bit more upmarket, not necessarily much more upmarket if you've ever stayed in some of the basic hotels, won't mention any by names, but the point is that a hotel is something which doesn't pretend to be very rustic. So in the 13th century, medical treatment was, of course, much less scientific. There were fewer travellers, and there would have been fewer facilities for them. So a hospital might have offered medical support to its local communities, and it might have also offered hospitality and hostel facilities to travellers. Furthermore, its hostel function might also have included the care of the elderly and infirm, a medieval old people's home, if you like, in the days before almshouses were established. I can't tell you which of these three facilities were offered at St. Lawrence's, although you might find it appropriate that until very recently, there was a St. Lawrence's old people home just up the hill from St. Lawrence Green. I'm sure that's a coincidence. So, why and how was a hospital associated with a chapel? To understand that, we have to talk about friars. Think about friars in fact and fiction. So we can introduce you to the first of those two chaps who we saw on my opening slide. If you've ever had the pleasure of studying Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, you might remember that includes a friar's tale. It's the one about a wicked church official who makes a pact with the devil to extract donations, which are supposedly for the church, but really to enrich himself. Very moral tale. And there's another friar, of course, who you'll remember if, like me, you watched children's TV in the 1960s. Friar Tuck from the long-running Robin Hood series. Jolly, overweight, always eating and drinking. I'm sure that the friars would have been horrified to find themselves portrayed in that way, but that's because they took themselves quite seriously. What I'm about to tell you is, in trying to make a distinction between monks and friars, what I'm about to say is really a serious oversimplification. But in medieval times, there was an important distinction between monks and friars. Most monks lived in closed communities. They were primarily contemplative. They were shut away from the world. They spent their lives studying and praying for the salvation of mankind. And there have been monks from the early days of the church, certainly in England. They go back way back into the pre-Saxon era. So the Celtic churches had monasteries and monks even back in those times. But in the medieval period, several orders of friars were established. Their lives were very different. They were all about working in and with the wider community. And this is where we find the link with hospitals, because some of those orders of friars were specifically termed hospitaller orders, which had an emphasis on caring for the sick, the disabled, and the aged. And also, they offered hospitality to pilgrims. This was the age of the Crusades. So many crusades over so many centuries, with both armies and pilgrims heading from Europe to what they termed the Holy Land. Whatever else you think about the Crusades and whatever else they achieved, they generated a flourishing local industry in the Eastern Mediterranean for taking pilgrims hostage and demanding ransom from their folks back home. One of the hospitaller orders of friars, the Trinitarian Order, founded in 1198, specifically focused on raising money for ransoming pilgrims, and they devoted 1/3 of their income to that purpose. The other 2/3 went on works of mercy, so caring for the sick and so forth, and on the maintenance of the brethren, the maintenance of their own friars. That picture changed over time, but certainly at the time of their foundation, they had this big thing about ransoming pilgrims. And this is important to our story because we know that by the 14th century, so we've moved on a bit here, but by the 14th century, St. Lawrence Chapel was being run by the Trinitarians. They had a main base in England was at Hounslow, in the shadow of Heathrow Airport, for those who like modern references. And they appear to have taken over 10 existing hospitals across the country, including those at Totnes and Crediton. Quite how that took place, don't know, haven't been able to find any record. And the episcopal authorities, certainly in the Diocese of Exeter, which would include Totnes and Crediton, continued to have some interest in the appointment of the wardens to run those hospitals. It's not terribly clear, as I say, but there are several references to succeeding bishops of Exeter appointing Trinitarian wardens to run the chapel and hospital at Crediton. And the first of those being Bishop Grandison, who appointed a man called William de Allerton, who was described as a priest and friar of Mottenden. Mottenden is, I think, Kent. It was one of the other Trinitarian bases. And he was appointed as the warden at Crediton in 1332. This travels on into the 15th century now, where John Loudon quotes of the convent of the Holy Trinity at Hounslow, main base, if you recall, for the Trinitarians, was the warden at Crediton in 1410. And just pause for a second just to note those last two appointments. It's not being called the priest in charge, it's not going to be called Father anybody, it's the warden. So this does suggest that there was a real importance to that secular function, that hospital function. There are other documents covering the period 1420 through to 1455. Again, we're talking about bishops' registers here, which include references to appointments, some of them referring to the custodian of the house or chapel of St. Lawrence at Crediton. One of the other questions which has intrigued a lot of people over the years is the possibility that St. Lawrence was a leper hospital. And there are several references in secondary sources, by which I mean published local histories, suggesting that it was. But I have to tell you that I can find absolutely no evidence for that. Nicholas Orme, a name you may have come across. Nicholas Orme was quite a big name in local history, a guy who was based at the University of Exeter for many years. And he wrote the definitive work on pre-Reformation hospitals in Devon, where he identified 41 of them. Big number, big county, but a big number of such hospitals. And 18 of those, according to Orme, 18 of those, not including Crediton, made provision for treating leprosy. Now, that's not to say that it never treated lepers, but I repeat that there is no evidence for it having done so. I think I'd suggest to you as well that it would be a particularly inappropriate location for a leper hospital, lying as it does immediately to the west of a marketplace and fairground. I rather think that the burgesses and stallholders of Crediton would have taken exception to being downwind of a community suffering from such a dreaded medical condition. Now, that's almost all I can tell you about the 300 years or so that St. Lawrence's functioned as a chapel and hospital, because everything changed in and around the very cataclysmic events of the Reformation. To borrow a bit of terminology from the Brexit story, these changes didn't happen as just one big cliff edge. Several religious institutions across the country were already becoming less active and less powerful before Thomas Cromwell came up with the plan for Henry VIII to become head of the church and take over all its assets. Crediton Church, for example, had several vacancies amongst its establishment of prebends and vicars choral in the early part of the 16th century. Even so, there's evidence that in 1523, some land which had been bequeathed to St. Lawrence Chapel, specifically a furling of land at Mount Jocelyn, which had been previously held by the Brothers of the Hospital of St. Lawrence, had been transferred to the use of the local church. And the same document reveals that there were still properties held by the chapel and that there was still a custodian there. So the chapel was still functioning in 1523, but basically was losing some of the property which had been bequeathed by it, which suggests to me that it wasn't as big, it wasn't as important, and certainly not as rich as it had been. At a national level, as everybody knows, during the Reformation, the monasteries were suppressed, and so were the friaries. The very last references we have to St. Lawrence in functioning as a religious institution comes from essentially a very unlikely source. In the lay subsidy returns, they are lay subsidy returns, they're talking about non-religious institutions of 1544, refer to a charge being levied on the fraternity there, the fraternity at St. Lawrence Chapel. So there was something still going on which involved friars, fraternity, so it's essentially the origin of the same word, in 1544. Well, very soon after that, in 1547, we find the first reference to the manor of Crediton at St. Lawrence. It's now a manor. It's no longer lands belonging to a chapel or a hospital. It's now become a manor. I've been unable to trace any documents which detail how this change of ownership happened. But by 1598, by the end of that century, it had become a sub-manor of the manor of Crediton. And when Elizabeth I generously granted the manor of Crediton to one of her courtiers in the 1590s, he commissioned a detailed survey of his lands, including what he termed the St. Lawrence lands. And this was a substantial estate. You appreciate that these are no longer in the ownership of the chapel, but they had been, and they had a big chunk of 240 lands, 240 acres of land, lying just to the northwest of the borough. There were 5 properties, small sort of house and garden type properties, lying in the east of town, another 3 in the borough, and a total of 13 properties lying within the borough, but outside of the town, which were generating high rents. They were generating an annual charge, an annual fee, if you like, which was being paid originally to the chapel. Now it was going to the manor. So it's only after it had passed into secular hands that we find that. And one of the joys of the survey, which William Killigrew, who just acquired this manor, one of the joys of it is that his survey included a map, and here it is. Or rather, here's my modern copy of it. People who know Crediton might recognise the location. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here's St. Lawrence Chapel and St. Lawrence Green lying at this junction of roads down here in the bottom right-hand corner. And running along here is the modern A377, the modern road running between Exeter and Barnstaple, as it does now. Not the main road in those days, not the main road for hundreds of years after that, but that clearly was a quite important delimiter of this estate, although it did sort of trickle over just to the south with these lands called Selwood Meads. What else can I tell you? There are basically 3 or 4 main chunks of land here. There's this area called Chapel Downs, still an area there called Chapel Downs to this day. It was in the name, folks. All held by a man called John Lee. There were the Selwood Meads here, just running along. There's a stream which runs down here, as some of you might know, and just the narrow little chunks of lands down there. There was an area of land here held by a man called Elias Bodley, and then a whole load of smaller chunks. These are strip fields, if you like, or the remnants of strip fields from an earlier period. No idea how many of these would have been enclosed, but they're all sort of jumbled up around here. Interesting little gap in the middle of this where there's no indication of a property holder. They're all called firs. This is where, forgive me those of you who don't know Crediton, but those who do might recognise this as the site of Queen Elizabeth Drive, which is a very deep declivity, and that area would have been used for the growing of firs, of course, which would have been used in the local bread ovens. Essentially, it was a major source of fuel for baking. I suppose the other thing that might amuse people, if you've ever wondered why this road down here called Landscore suddenly becomes known as Westwood Road at somewhere about this point. Well, it's that point there, and it denotes the end of the land shore, the shared boundary between the Great Park over here and the St. Lawrence lands. So it's the land shore, the land score until that point, and beyond that it's no longer the St. Lawrence lands, so it's no longer a boundary between the two of them. Tells you something about the ancientness of that name and the fact that it relates not just to the edge of the Great Park, but it's the interface, if you like, between the Great Park and the St. Lawrence lands. Gosh, much of this is still farmland today. There's a view from the field behind Westonleigh, and you can see here that big, or most of that big area of farmland. This is Chapel Downs Farm here. So Chapel Downs stretches all along this, and the land falls away into this sort of valley along here and extends a bit further that way. It's just lovely to think of the landscape that we have today reflecting, even down to some of these field boundaries, incidentally, reflecting an estate as it was in 1598. But I digress. We've got to move away from the chapel itself. Once the chapel had been stripped of its religious function, and indeed its income, it slid into obscurity. I can't find any other references to the building itself until about 150 years later, in 1743, when our lovely and very detailed map of the town shows it as St. Lawrence's Chapel, now converted into dwelling houses. That's about it in terms of the 17th and 18th centuries. But in the 19th century, you've got the rise of the antiquarian movement, reflecting a revived interest in historic remains. And we've got this quote here from Samuel Rowe, who in 1841 was the vicar of Crediton, and he wrote about the chapel in an article about the history of the town, saying that, I quote, "Little trace of the sacred character of the edifice remains, except the east and west windows, which are in tolerable presentation." So he's saying that the place is in a pretty ruinous state, but the two gable ends our intolerable presentation. Well, he wasn't the only person, Rowe wasn't the only person to see the potential of this building for people with an antiquarian mindset. What most people would have seen as 3 nondescript cottages were bought by a lady called Ellen Camilla Drake of Windswood in Crediton in 1914. This is what she would have seen. She would have seen this place which doesn't look remotely like a chapel. Unfortunately, we can't see the ends in this picture because I think those windows were still in a tolerable state of preservation. But what we can see here is the frontage. It's the bit which faces the main road of these 3 cottages. Well, Drake, she wanted to rip out all the secular elements and restore the building to something like its former self as a memorial to her husband, who had died not long before. So you can see here what they look like, and this location map, which is one of the things we come across in the archives at GAMS, which History and Museum Society. There's a location map from the title deeds when she bought it in 1914, and you can see it's referred to as St. Lawrence's Chapel, remains of. So this red area here, this is the land which is being bought. Here are the 3 buildings of the chapel, as you can see there, and these 3 entrances, 1, 2, 3, are these 3 doors, 1, 2, 3 here. You've got that bit of land in front of it, which is the garden, and it's still accessed by something which was then called a chapel court. It's still just like a little sort of entranceway in front of the houses on that side, and there's a house over here as well. So this is still the way into this day. So we can recognize the layout. It pushes it to actually try to recognize the property itself. And why is that? Well, Ellen Drake invested a generous sum of money into this project. And she commissioned the second man, who you may possibly remember from my opening slide, Sir Charles Nicholson. And Charles Nicholson was a very, very well-respected man in terms of work on historic churches. He'd done a number of commissions before this, some of them quite high-profile commissions, and she asked him to undertake the restoration. He brought to this a very different approach from most of those Victorian church restorers, not so many years before this, who had enthusiastically destroyed so much of our ancient heritage in church buildings. Nicholson championed the use of traditional designs and traditional materials. Well, amazingly, and quite unexpectedly, we found amongst an unsorted file of papers that CAMS still had somehow had acquired a specification and some of the drawings for the restoration which Nicholson completed in 1921. They reveal that the original proposal, as shown here, this is an east elevation, the original proposal had included an extension to the south front of the building, the bit that includes the main door in from the road, to provide a porch and a vestry, as per this part of the building here. So whereas what you see today ends at this point, so we've got the main body of the chapel as original and as now, we're going to build on this little single story extension. That idea was clearly dropped. I don't know why. It would have been a very expensive thing to do and was probably thought to be inappropriate. But nonetheless, the other stuff that we've got here in the specification, that gives us an immense amount of work, of detail about the work which was done. So here's a little drawing, which is sort of in amongst this handwritten specification. And the builders were asked to take down the roof and the south facade, a bit with all the doors and the windows of the cottages that they wanted to replace. And they wanted to replace them with lancet windows, which were in keeping with a medieval chapel. And they're very much a feature of the design now, those very narrow lancet windows. Nobody knows what the original facade would have looked like, of course, but what we've got now is Nicholson's interpretation, based on his professional skills and his knowledge of religious buildings of that era. I'm no expert on such things, but I'd say he did a pretty impressive job. His specification, as well as all this major reconstruction work, includes details of the flooring. And I was delighted to find this lovely detail, little sketch drawing within the specification, which was turned into the floor that you can now see within the chapel itself. Here's a photograph which was taken just inside the east end of the chapel. And you'll find that these little hatched squares between the brick paviers have been translated into these lovely little things with a little pebble-like, cobble-like surface on them. Very much a sort of a neat interpretation of the plans, no doubt getting hold of something which the builder could find, or maybe the architect found them for him. I love it. I think it's great. He also specified external works, including the laying of that lovely cobblestone path which runs up to the front door. There is a local legend, there is a local belief, if you like, that this is one of the oldest paths in Crediton. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint anybody who believes that. It was put down in 1921. It may have replaced what was already there, I'm not denying that, but this was laid in 1921. And as I say, it gives lovely character, it gives a lovely period feel to the piece. Finally, he also specified the very handsome gate and even produced this drawing of how it should be made. And it's very much like what is still there today. Look at that. That's a nice piece of that sort of lovely arts and craftsy feel that pervades a lot of this building. So there you have it. That's a history stretching back over nearly 800 years, but it's a chapel which was extensively rebuilt 100 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, that doesn't detract from the story, it just adds an extra layer of interest. When you think what might have happened if one of those enthusiastic Victorian, let's tear it all apart and replace it with something modern, one of the people who did that with so many churches, it's so good that we have a sympathetically restored chapel to remind us of a long, varied and fascinating history. So Crediton History and Museum Society has just now published a booklet written by myself to coincide with that 100th anniversary of the restoration. You won't find all the background stuff from this talk, so I'm sorry if anybody wants any pictures from Friar Tuck, they'll have to find them for themselves. But you will find various aspects of this story told in more detail, with notes about the sources where you can actually access that material. The museum's closed at the moment, so you can only get the booklet by post, and here are the contact details. So I'll leave those up there whilst I say thank you very much for listening to this talk, and ask if anybody's got any questions for me.
Lovely. Thank you, Tony. If anyone does want to ask a question, please type it into the chat window or indicate by pressing the raise hand button on the bottom or by some other means, if you would wish to do so. There's one question that came up during the talk. We'll just address that and then we can unshare your screen because everybody will have got the details by then. David Nation asked whether we know if the Wardens actually lived at the chapel.
We don't. There's no indication of who lived where, essentially. Clearly, the building which we have today would have been much too small to have included accommodation, staff accommodation, if you like. So somewhere, one would hope that if you were able to dig down deep enough between all the, the sort of the modern layers, you may be able to find that there were other surrounding buildings, but I wouldn't hold out too much hope for that. I don't know how many people would have been essentially working there when it was functioning as a hospital and chapel, but it would have been quite a community, I imagine. We just have to guess at where they might have lived. Sorry, I can't help more than that.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you.
I'll stop
Okay.
sharing.
Yes, if you stop sharing your screen out, if anybody else wants to turn their camera back on and feel part of the room, please do feel free to do so at this point, bearing in mind you will appear in the recording if you do. A couple of other questions. Ellie Babbage asks if you have any photos of the inside of the chapel, for example, the window.
There are some. I haven't put them in here because I didn't want to run into any copyright problems. There are a couple of photographs. There is actually an interesting one from the late 19th century of one of the end windows from the outside. You could find it via the Devon Heritage Centre website. There's an external shot from the 19th century. But as those guys are all closed up at the moment, I chickened out of the whole business, the whole nightmare of trying to get hold of copyright.
Fair enough. Isabel asks, do you think the present external wall with the new door and windows of 1921 is original?
One of the things which, that's a very good question, because one of the things which Nicholson was very keen to specify was that original materials which were being taken down should be reused as far as possible. And where it was possible to do so, to use them in or close to their previous positions. So essentially, yes, a lot of that would be ancient stones reused. As you'll appreciate, on that south wall, the one which faces the road, that would have been almost completely rebuilt because so much of that was doors and windows of the cottages. So that would have been long gone before that. But the back wall would have been quite a lot of original material there, and on the rest of the building, they reused original material as far as they could. One of the little details which I didn't go into there in the specification, the builder is asked to take down the roof and save as many of the original tiles as he possibly can. How many were original are up there now? I wouldn't like to say, but this was all part of this sympathetic restoration thing, which Nicholson and I guess Camilla Drake were very keen on.
Pam asks, who's responsible for the funding and the maintenance of the chapel now?
I believe that it now comes under the parish church at Crediton. I know at one time the chapel was used a lot by Queen Elizabeth's School here in the town, but chatting a while back to one of the people who keeps the gardens, I was led to understand that it falls under the parish church. There is a group called Friends of St Lawrence Chapel who are responsible for it. They take a lot of interest in its upkeep, and they run various events. There are people, for example, who have reintroduced this idea of St Lawrence Fair. But I think that's essentially a sort of charitable fundraising group rather than the people who have the ownership of the building.
Okay. Another question from Isabel. Do you have any view on who might have paid for the original building in the 13th century?
That's a really good one. One of the things which intrigues me is that in the 13th century we have these bequests of land because the chapel is being run at that stage in an era when the bishops of Exeter, when the registers of the bishops of Exeter still exist. So they record property transactions in a lot of detail. What we don't know is what happened before 1242. We don't know, for example, where that whopping great 240 acres around Chapel Downs, no idea who gave that, when they gave it, or how that was built in the how that was affected in the building of the establishment before 1242. These are all things lost in the mist of times.
It's good to have an air of mystery about some parts of these things.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a note from Anne just to say Crediton PCC pays for the running costs and the church governors are responsible for repairs and maintenance.
Thank you. That's a good clarification.
There we go. Anybody else got anything they would like to ask? Please indicate at this point if you do. I think we are pretty much there. Okay, in that case, it just remains for me, before I tell you what's coming up next month, to invite you all to please show your appreciation to Tony for his presentation in whichever Zoom fashion you see fit. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. Much appreciated.